Good morning. Welcome to the first session of the second day. Next speaker is Vidal-Llana, who is a member of the research group Risk Center, who is doing a visiting stay in Vancouver.
So, well, as I said, good morning, everyone. I'm very glad to be here, and I hope that you are having a good time. I was going to be there, but in the end, I had to go, and I want to thank the organization to having me there and letting me doing this online. So yeah, the paper that we are going to talk about it's about value at risk and conditional time expectation that maybe a lot of you already know. This has been jointly work with Vincenzo Coia from the University of British Columbia, which I'm doing a research stay, and also at Guillen. So the outline of the presentation is very simple. We will start with a little motivation. We'll present the data set and the results, some conclusions with a recap. So it will be very simple. So we can have a coffee after and talk about it. So when we talk about risk evaluation, we are in a conference about risk. So we have to talk about heavy tail distributions. I have seen several presentations about quantile regression. So this is a crucial part of risk assessment. So when we have long conditional tails in our data sets, quantile regression algorithms, so quantile regression-based algorithms have a very rich paper here. So they are commonly used to assess extreme quantile behaviors. Two of the most common estimators that we use in these branches are the value at risk. Maybe everybody here knows value at risk, which is nothing more than identifying net quantile of the conditional quantile of a distribution. Here is the mathematical definition. And after that, we have the conditional tail expectation, also known as tail value at risk, also known as expected shortfall. You know that we all like to call a lot of ways the same thing. But in the end, it's nothing more than the expected value over the value at risk. Two notes that I want to do here. It's that the value at risk is defined for the right part of the distribution. So we are assessing here in this definition the right part, so the high quantiles, and therefore the CTE, it's the expected value over the quantile. This could be defined in the opposite way to the left part of the distribution, and therefore the CTE would be the expected value below the value at risk. The second thing that I wanted to note here is that the movement from the value at risk to the CTE, it's mainly based or mainly motivated from the Basel III agreement, in which the risk assessed in banking sector now has to be done using these estimators. So when we talk about CTE, one of the main problems that should come into our minds is the elicitability. What is the elicitability? While this is a very strange term, it's nothing more than the existence of a scoring function that is strictly consistent. So the existence of a function that we can optimize in our software of preference to evaluate it or to calculate it. So netting defined the elicitability as this. Acerbi and Sekeli in 2014, they found a consistent scoring function for the CTE, but they didn't open the discussion. So they didn't talk about the elicitability of the CTE, but they found a strictly consistent scoring function. It was after 2 years after, in which Fiesel and Siegel, they proved that the CTE alone is not elicitable, but the pair value at risk CTE is. So they presented a general loss function for the value at risk CTE, and they proved that the CTE alone is not elicitable. It's common sense for this, non-mathematically speaking, that because the CTE needs the bar to be calculated beforehand. We cannot calculate directly CTE. We don't know in the bar, obviously. It's the expected value over or below. So which are these scoring functions that I'm talking about? For the value at risk, it's nothing more than the one proposed by Conker and Basset almost 50 years ago. That almost everybody that has done quantile regression knows. And the scoring function for the CTE, it's quite a little bit more complicated, but in the end, it's a strictly consistent scoring function that depends on two functions that are G1 and G2. Yeah, they have these two functions have to meet some conditions in order to the scoring function to be strictly consistent. I mean, below we have the meanings. There is another branch that I want to talk about. It's the non-crossing algorithms. So Acevedo and Sekeli, in the paper that I was talking before, they realized that when they were calculating the value at risk and the CTE for the same quantile level, they found that there are times that they were crossing, which makes no sense. So having a value at risk that is greater than a CTE for the right part of the tail makes no sense, right? But when we are using these scoring functions, we get this. We cannot avoid it. They proposed a way to avoid it, but it was like putting some constants and that, and we have to calculate more things. So quite tedious. This line of research, not talking about the CTEs, but for several quantiles, has been studied along the years. So they have there are some algorithms that can allow us to predict several quantile levels without crossing. So for predicting two quantile levels for a response variable, they will not cross anywhere because the scoring function from Conker and Basset allows crossing. There are even recent advances that allow non-crossing for several values at risk and neural networks. And this year, we have a working paper that we have been working a lot in this, in which we solve a problem that we saw here, is that there is no way to calculate for several quantile levels value at risk and CTEs while meeting these conditions. So we have a joint neural network that predicts several values at risk and CTEs with all non-crossing conditions. But there is something that I didn't mention about. So if you remember the scoring function from the CTE, there were two functions there. What about the choosing of these functions? Does it matter to our prediction? Does it matter to the computational time of our models? So this is what we are tackling here in this paper. We are getting several selections of G1 and G2, and we are comparing them and comparing the results and the computational time. There is some studies that talk about this, but they don't enter in so they don't say this is the best approximation or this is the way to go for doing this. Taylor in 2020 talk a little bit more about this. So these are the specifications that we compare. There are 7. We are going to call loss function 0, 1, 2, so on. And this meets all the properties for creating a strictly consistent scoring function for the CTE. Which is the dataset used? The dataset used, it's a very simple one. We are using drivers from 1 year, the data from drivers. We are going to predict the kilometers traveled above the speed limit using the logarithm of the kilometers traveled, the percentage driven in urban areas, the percentage of night driving, the age and the gender of the driver. And we have almost close to 10,000 observations. One thing that I wanted to note here is that here we have in the left part the response variable and two explanatory variables, and we can see the problem of the heavy tails. In the left panel, we see that there is a heavy tail there. We have to calculate this as risk analysts, as risk assessors. We have to analyze this. So when we see these histograms, the first thing that comes into our mind is how much cost does this tail comes to us? Is going to give to us. So the results are straightforward. what we are presenting here is the computational time, seconds for the 7 specifications. What we have is that the loss function 0 and 1 have a low amount of time, the loss function 2 a medium amount of time, and the resting 4 have a high amount of time here. But we cannot rely only on the computational time, right? What we thought that was a nice way to visualizing this is that we have a lot of scoring functions. Why not evaluate all the predictions with all those scoring functions as optimizers and evaluating them with all the scoring functions? This is what we have here. So for the quantile level 0.9, in each row we have the loss function that we have used to predict, and in the column the loss function that we have used to evaluate the predictions, right, for the model. What we see is that the loss function 6 has, in bold we have the best of each column. The loss function 6 has 4 out of 7 models that surpasses or outperforms the other models. The second one will be the loss function 2, which has the loss function 2 and 3. One point of note here is that what we will expect is that for each loss function itself will be the best performing one, as is the loss function that it's optimizing, right? So this is a point to have in note here. So what happens when we are moving into more extreme quantile levels? So we have done in our study for 0.925, 0.95, 97.5, and 99. And what happens when we are moving up in the quantile level is that the loss function 2 starts to shine. So what we have for the quantile level 0.99 is that 6 out of 7 loss functions give it as the best approximation, the best scoring model. So it's straightforward. The results speak for themselves. I want to recap this. So we are estimating value at risk and CTE jointly. And there is one problem, a minimal problem for the analyst, that is the choosing of G1 and G2. We propose here, we have tested several loss functions. They are in the literature. Most of them are in the literature and they are in several papers. And we have shown that the loss function 2, relying in our data, obviously, it's the best performing one because it has a medium computational time, and all the models or almost all the models give it the best as the best way to predict. So that's all for me. I want to have special acknowledgement for the organizational team. As I said before, the UBC, Department of Statistics in Coia have been very helpful, and several of our sponsors here. Some references for the interested reader, and many thanks. If you have any questions, I will be more than glad to answer them.
Thank you. Thank you, Chancho. There is any question? I have a question, Chancho. Is that I enjoyed really a lot your talk. It was very nice. If I understood correctly, when you are comparing these alternative methods of scoring functions, you need to select different confidence levels for the quantiles, like in the paper that you mentioned.
Yeah, I have done this for 5 quantile levels.
And my question was, which quantile levels you choose and why?
Okay, so I was choosing the right part of the tail because I was focusing on it. So what we have chosen is the 0.9, 925, 95, 975, and 99, if I remember correctly. But I think that this is.
You need to use all of them at the same time for jointly estimate to avoid this crossing problem.
It's estimated all at the same time. So we have the predictions. So we ensure inside the neural network that all the predictions will be non-crossing. Because if we do a model separately for 0.9 and for the quantile level 0.92, we are not sure that if for any observation, maybe one or maybe none, but maybe one observation, it crosses. It makes no sense.
Yes, I know the problem, and I know that is a really big problem. My second question then, related with the first one, is how could affect to choose more quantile levels or to choose quantile levels lower than 90%? Do you know?
That was a very, very interesting part in the exploratory, but for the working paper in which we present the neural network, and we found that the addition of quantile levels did not increase the computational time, but predicted better, so improved the results until a certain point. Like starting from the quantile 0.9 to the right part, against starting from the 8 to the right part, we found that the quantile 0.9 was predicted better using lower quantile, so not starting with that. So it's very curious, and we tested this a lot. We found that a grid part of the right part of a grid of quantile levels from the right part is the best way to go.
Thank you very much. No more question for me. Last thanks to Chencho. Next talk is given by Miss Toth-Lakits from Eötvös Loránd University, Hungary.
I'm a second-year PhD student, so this is my collaborated work with my two supervisors, Arató Miklós and Gábor Molnár-Sáska. Sorry, I think it's... Okay, it's working. Okay, sorry. So I'm going to talk about modeling negative rates, which is not the case at the moment, where the interest rate is really high. So, but a few years ago, it was really actual. So here we can see a 2-year government bond from Japan. This is a yield curve. Of course, it's very volatile. So our aim is to try to create very similar trajectories to what we have seen in this picture. Of course, this is the main goal of the financial modelist as well. So we want to create trajectories that also contain the future information, which we can see at the current prices on the market. And why we want to do that is because we want to price financial assets and then manage the risk, or in other words, we want to hedge. And of course, as you may know, mostly the models are defined by stochastic differential equations. So we are going to give a different approach to this. We are differentiate 4 main steps of the analysis. The first one is how to find the right trajectories, the right model class. And after that, we got the distribution. We can talk about how to calibrate the parameters, how to fit the model into the data to what we have seen in the market. And after that, we can price financial assets, and we can talk about hedging. In this presentation, we are going to focus about finding the statistically appropriate trajectories. So, after the middle of the 2010s, the interest rates have fallen below 0. This was a thing that no one expected to have, because we always assume that the interest rates have to be 0 or positive. So there was a really chaos at the market when the rate dropped below 0. As we can see in this yield curve from Japan, in the middle of the 2010s, the rate dropped below 0. It can give an explanation because the economical conditions, due to the economical conditions, the central banks were forced to lower the interest rates below 0, and that's how the negative rates appeared. So, at the moment, all the mathematical models which were given to model the interest rates failed, because there was an assumption that the rates could never be negative. So we have to reconsider all the models, or extended the models into the negative rate as well. Before I talk about the model, I want to define 3 mathematical subjects. The first one is a multivariate normal random vector. We call X a random vector multivariate normal if the product of the Cy, Xy is Gaussian for every possible choice of Cy. And with the help of this definition, we can define what a Gaussian random field is. A random field X is a Gaussian random field if x1, x2, and xm is multivariately normal for any choice of xy. We call it a mean zero Gaussian random field, of course, if the expected value is 0. So if the expected value is 0, the covariance function is reduced only to the product of the expected value. The expected value of the product, sorry. And this is our main definition that we need to the model, which is a Brownian sheet. It's very similar to the Brownian motion, which is well known in the industry, but maybe the Brownian sheet is not so much, so I wanted to make a slide for it. So what is a Brownian sheet? This is a centered Gaussian process, which is indexed by n and d, where n is a real positive parameter, and it takes values in Rd. So we can see that the covariance structure is really similar to what we have seen in the Brownian motion. So the covariance function has to be 0 if I not equals to j, but otherwise, if they are equal, it has to be the product of the minimum values of the vector. So we can make a remark that if we take a line which is parallel to one of the axes, then B is reduced to a d-dimensional Brownian motion. So in the 1970s, which was quite a long time ago, Kennedy came up with the idea that these Gaussian random fields should be used to model the forward rates. But at that time, it was like, we don't need that because this can generate negative rates. But in the 2010, it became relevant again. So that's why we hold back to this article and rethink about it, because it really handles the negative rate naturally. Because if we if we look at the industry, what are the big industries do? They are just shift the model into the negative range. They are talk about, let's shift it with 5% to the negative rates, and that's it. And if the rates drop below this minus 5%, then you have to recalibrate the whole model again. So you don't have to deal with it if we talk about the Kennedy fields, because it's a natural way to handle the negative rates. And another really favorable property of the Kennedy field, that analytical maximum likelihood estimations can be given to the parameters. So this is how the field is defined. Of course, we got two variables for the forward rates, and it's because of the definition of the forward rates. And we have a drift process, which is deterministic and a continuous function. And this X is the centered Gaussian random fields, which we have talked about earlier. The covariance function is in this case, which is the main point is that it depends on the minimum value of the first parameters. Of course, in finance, we want to price assets, and we can do it in the risk-neutral measure. Therefore, there is a special shape for the expected value and the covariance matrix as well, because we have to talk about the martingale property and the stationary, and that's why we can change to the martingale measure to the risk-neutral measure. So it has to be in these not so beautiful shapes. And how this whole framework can connect it to the industry right now. Some of you may know the Heath-Jerome-Morton framework, which is a term structure model. What is a term structure model? A term structure basically means that it creates a connection between the bonds with different maturities. So it's not just modeling one point of the yield curve, but it models the whole yield curve at at the time. So this is a widespread model in the industry. So this HIM framework, and it's also an infinite dimensional framework. The interesting thing is, if we choose the drift and the volatility deterministic, then we get back the Heath-Jarrett-Morton framework from this whole Kennedy field thing. So it's basically more general than the Heath-Jarrett-Morton framework. So there are some theorems which from my supervisor, but I don't really have time to talk about it. So we are basically did a change of the measure to price financial assets, and help with the Radon-Nikodym derivative, we can also get to the maximum likelihood estimation, which is right there. So if you are interested, you can look it up, but I don't really have time to go into details. So how did we do the parameter estimations? We did two types of parameter estimations, because we noticed that if we look at the covariance field where the difference between the two time variables is fixed, so the difference here is t, and is also the difference between the two time variables is t, so then the process is reduced to an Orton-Uhlenbeck process. So therefore, if we can observe the forward rates for different t values, then we can get estimation to the sigma square, mu, and lambda as well with probability 1. So this is how we are going to estimate these three parameters. We can look at another glance of the forward rate. If we logarithmize the time scale of the first parameter, then the covariance structure is more simplified than it was before. It can reduce to this. Sorry, I don't really want to read the expressions out loud because they are longer than this. So therefore, we can get estimations for sigma, for lambda, and for mu as well with probability 1. So this is what we did in the simulation. I forgot to mention that this field has 4 parameters, so we only got one left, which is nu. And we could derive a maximum likelihood estimation for the parameter nu with the help of the Radon-Nikodym derivative. Yeah, it's not the most beautiful thing that you're going to see today, but it's analytical form, so we are quite happy about it. And I want to talk a little bit about practice, how it can be connected, and what are future goals to do. And practice is really important how fast the model can run, how flexible and accurate the parameters are, and how easy to interpret them. And of course, how well it can be calibrated, because the market is always changing really fast, so it's really important. And what we did is we want to simulate these Kennedy fields, but it took a lot of time because of the big size of the covariance matrix, because if we want to simulate a multidimensional normal distributed vector with the size of this big covariance matrix, that it's extremely slow. So we did a different thing. We noticed that if we simulate a Brownian sheet, and then we look at the sheet at different time points, and we see this expression, then this expression is going to give back the desired Kennedy field with the appropriate covariance structure that we need. So it was way more easier than we thought before, because then we just had to simulate independent random variables, which are normally distributed with the expected value of 0, and the covariance of this this term, which is connected to the Brownian sheet, of course. And if we took a double sum, then we got back the Brownian sheet. And if we took this expression, then we got back to the Kennedy field that we needed. Here we can see some simulated forward field, as I call. So we can notice that the forward rates are really volatile. This is what we expect. and also it can take negative values as well. These fields are not calibrated, so that's why it takes really high negative values. It's a work in progress, so we only got the fields. So overall, what we can say, what we can conclude, that we have new results because we could derive the estimation of the parameters of the Kennedy field. And we are working on the derivation of the analytical prices of different financial assets. We are working on European calls, swaptions, and basically that is it right now at the moment. And our next step is going to be to calibrate the field to real market data. And of course, our further goal, our main goal, is to create also a neural network to get the parameters, and we can compare the analytical results with the parameters from the neural network. And this is also my PhD topic, so we got a ton of time to do this. So here are my main references, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you to the speakers for her talk. There is any question, any comment? Yeah. Okay, one moment, please.
Oh, thank you for your talk.
Thank you.
So, if interest rates become too negative,
yeah,
then people could simply put their money in the safe and place a guard in front of it. So there should be a lower bound for interest rates. And would it be possible to include a lower bound into your model?
I haven't really think about it to put a lower bound in it, because we wanted to, because we seen models that have lower bounds. We worked with Shifty Sabre. I don't really know if you know that. We worked with Shifty Sabre as well, and that was our main problem, that it has a lower bound. So we haven't think about it. Yeah.
But I think a lower bound is a good feature.
Yeah. I don't really know, but it was a different alternative, but I'm going to consider it. Thank you.
There are more questions, suggestions? Last thanks to the speaker. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next speaker is Mr. Junike from the University of Oldenburg.
First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for giving me the chance to speak today here in Barcelona in front of you. Today, I will talk about precise option pricing by the cost method and how to choose the truncation range. This is a joint work with Konstantin Pankrashkin. In this talk, we will look at the following problem. We have a stock, and the price of the stock in a future time can be derived by the random variable st. And we look at x. So x is just the centralized log returns. That is, x is defined by the logarithm of st minus c, and c is the expectation of the logarithm of st. We assume that x has a known characteristic function phi, but an unknown density f. For many financial models in finance, for example, the Hester model or many Levy models, the characteristic function phi is well known, but the precise structure of the density is unknown. The price of a put option is then given by the discounted expectation of the put option, and that can be written as the integral of minus infinity to infinity of v times f, where v is just the payoff function of the put option, and f is the density, the unknown density of x. Now the question is, how can this last integral be solved very fast? So why do we need to compute option prices fast? Usually, in practice, a stock price model is calibrated to given liquid option prices. And during the calibration routine, we need to evaluate option prices very often. At a first glance, it seems to be quite difficult to solve this integral because the density f is unknown. Fang and Osterle, they proposed the so-called COS method, which approximates the density in 3 steps and then solves the integral. So the 3 steps are the following. In the first step, we truncate the density by some large interval minus L and L. So remember, by our definition of x is centralized at 0, so expectation of x is 0, and therefore the density is centralized around 0 as well. And in the second approximation, we approximate our truncated density by some Fourier series. And in the third step, of the approximation, we approximate the Fourier coefficients an by some other coefficients cn. And this function en are the basis function, which are just defined by cosine function, because the name of the method is the COS method, and the an are the classical cosinus coefficients of the truncated density. That is an integral of minus L to L of f times the basis function. And then we approximate this integral by an integral of over the whole real line, which is possible if L is large enough. And this last integral can be solved explicitly. That is a little exercise and can be expressed by the real part of the characteristic function phi of the log returns, and the characteristic function are given in closed form. So this coefficients Cn can be computed explicitly. Then for some function v, so v is the payoff function of our put option. We can define some coefficients Vn by the integral of minus L to L of v times the basis function. And for put options, this Vn can be solved explicitly as well. So v of x is just a truncated exponential, and the integral of an exponential times some cosinus function can be solved explicitly. Then Fang and Osterle call the following approximation of the price of a put option COS method. So the left-hand side is equal to the price of a put option, and that is approximated by replacing f by its approximation, so the sum of Cn times En, and then we use the definition 2 to see that this integral can be approximated by a sum of Cn times Vn. And by the way, this prime here means that the first factor in the sum is weighted by a half. Now the question is how to choose the truncation range minus L to L. And Fang and Osterle proposed some rule of thumb. So they suggested to choose the interval minus L to L by plus minus 10 times the square root of the second cumulant plus the square root of the fourth cumulant. And for the Hess model, the fourth cumulant is 2 involved. So for the Hess model, they suggested to define L by 12 times the standard deviation of x. So 12 times the standard deviation of x, that sounds like a pretty large interval. But there are counterexamples where the rule of thumb do not work. And in this talk, we will find an L such that the cost method provable works. So let epsilon be some error tolerance, and let k be an even natural number. Then we define L by the kth square root of 2 capital K times mu k divided by epsilon, where capital K is just the strike of the put option, and mu k is the kth moment of the density. Then we can show that there is a natural number NL such that for all natural number n which are greater or equal to NL, the price of our put option only differs by an epsilon of the approximating price of the put option. And we have some conditions for this approximation to hold. So F has to be bounded and has to have semi-heavy tails. So this holds for many stock price models. For instance, the Hess model and many Levy models have bounded and semi-heavy tails. The function v is bounded by k. That is very easy for our put option. It's bounded by k by definition. And the epsilon should be small enough. So if you look into our paper, there's another formula, a more complicated formula, if epsilon is big. The next question is how this k should be chosen. Here in this figure, you see for the Black-Scholes model and the Laplace model, the value L for different choices of k. And we see that for large k, the value L somewhat converges. And we suggest to use k equal to 8 in practice, because if k is greater or equal than 8, then L does not change much anymore. The next question is how to compute the kth moment. And we could simply take the characteristic function and compute the kth derivative, and then evaluate that derivative at u equal to 0. That sounds very simple, but in practice, the characteristic function v might be so involved that it is simply computationally too expensive to evaluate the derivative. This is, for example, the case for the Hess model. So instead, we could take the following approach. If the model x depends on some parameters theta, for instance, the log returns in the Hess model depends on 5 parameters, then we defined a function h, or we needed to find a function h, which maps the parameter theta to the 8th moment. And what we do, or what we propose, we propose to find an approximation h hat of h up front before we use the cost method. And how can we find that? So we can compute mu h for many different theta just once, and then define h hat by a regression. So you can choose your favorite regression like random forest or neuronal network or whatever you prefer. And the evaluation of h hat is assumed to be very fast. On the last two slides, we can observe what happens if the truncation range is chosen too small. So here you see the density of the Merton jump diffusion model, which has two peaks, one peak around 0 and another peak at minus 7.5, which describes the jump in the Merton jump diffusion model. The gray line is the exact solution of the density, which is known in closed form, and the dashed line is the approximation of the density with the truncation range chosen by the rule of thumb, which we introduced in the beginning of the talk. And we clearly see that the dashed line is not capable of capturing the jump of the jump diffusion model. The dotted line is using our truncation range, which is based on Markov's inequality. And we see that the dotted line and the gray line are equal. On this last slide, we see how the choice of the truncation range affects the price of the option. So the gray line, that is the exact price in the Merton jump diffusion model, and the dashed line here diverges, or it does not converge to the true price. So you may put an epsilon around the gray line, and then the dashed line is far away from the gray line, and the dotted line does converge to the price. And this example shows that it's very important to choose the truncation range correctly. And the takeaway of this talk is that I hope that you learned how to choose the truncation range. On this slide, you see the references, and our paper is this last reference. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Junike. There is time for questions, comments. Last thanks to Mr. Junike. Thank you. The last speaker of this session is Ignacio Garrón, who is coming from the University of Barcelona, and the work who is going to present is entitled Daily Growth at Risk, Financial or Real Drivers. The answer is not always the same.
My name is Ignacio. I'm going to be presenting this paper titled Daily Growth at Risk, Financial or Real Variables. The answer is not always the same. This is a joint work with my supervisors, Elena Chuliá and Jorge Uribe. This will be the table of contents of the presentation. I will start with the motivation. For the ones who do not know about growth at risk is the term pioneered by Adrian 2019, which is the measure of the 10% quantile or 50% conditional quantile of the GDP growth distribution, which is conditioned on the lagged value of current or the current GDP growth and financial condition index. So this framework has extended over multiple organizations, central banks, and it's a benchmark to gauge the downside risk in GDP. So with this framework, you get essentially, instead of the forecast of the median of the GDP growth, you get a forecast of GDP growth considering a bad scenario. This will be, for example, like a value at risk for the GDP growth, okay? So one question that arises from this traditional framework is that are financial conditions the only source of GDP downside risk? What about real variables? So here there are a couple of papers who argue that during the global financial crisis, while GDP growth declined, also many other real variables also worsened, not only financial variables. So there is more or less a contemporaneous relationship, okay? So for them, it's not clear that only financial variables are the ones that explain a downside risk in GDP growth, okay? The second motivation here has to do with the fact that, as you may know, financial indicators are daily or even have higher frequency. But in this framework, the authors are considering the average over 1 quarter of a financial indicator. So one question that arises here is that should we use instead a higher frequency financial indicator that, for example, acknowledge the daily flow or weekly flow of financial information? And here we have 2 excellent papers of Carriero and Ferrara who do this for the first one for the US using weekly indicators, and the second one for the Eurozone using daily indicators. Okay, so what do we do in this paper? I will show you a real-time daily growth at risk nowcast of the GDP growth of the US. So this will be weird. I will show you an estimate, a daily estimate that you can track for every day for the US economy using both daily and financial indicators. And I'll show you that these are really important to explain the onset or to gauge the risk on the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I will use 12 high-frequency indicators, 11 financial indicators, and 1 real indicators, and I will estimate, say, 7 different models, namely Midas-like models and Lasso-type models. And I will use a forecast combination scheme in order to further improve my forecast of the growth at risk. I will evaluate my technique, my framework, against the traditional framework, and I will evaluate, for example, individual GAR estimates against my combined GAR estimate. Okay, so the data, it's interesting because it's in real time, and it spans the period from 1986 to December 31st of 2020. First, I have the real gross domestic product collected in real time. As you may recall, GDP growth has at least 3 revisions every quarter because of statistical reasons and the flow of information. And I will use as the real indicator the Aruba, Diebold, and Scotty index, which is mainly the only indicator that you can capture that is a real indicator. And because this is an estimate, I will collect this indicator in real time. So for each quarter that I observe, I will use the I will use the vintage corresponding of that quarter. Okay, and for the rest of the financial indicators, these do not have revision, so I just take from the market. And I have interest rate spread, credit spread. I have, for example, the FAMA French variables. I have the VXO index, term spread, credit spread. And also, in red, I have the composite indicator of systemic stress for the US, which is a composite indicator for many other financial indicators. And I will be using this as a benchmark also. Okay, so moving to the methodology, I will extend the conditional 10% quantile of the GDP growth using a vector of high frequency indicator called capital X that goes from T, capital T, to HT days. So what I mean with this vector of high frequency indicators? So in order to accommodate the daily flow of information into quarterly information, what I do is that for every quarter, I construct this huge matrix with 1 year lag of daily information, in which, for example, the first variable is the first day of each quarter of each year, okay? For the first day of each quarter of the financial indicator. So I construct a time series that is quarter for the first day of a given quarter of a given financial indicator, and then I go I lag this expression until 1 year. Okay. So at the end, I have a 1 year lag high frequency matrix. Okay, so in that sense, I can convert daily indicator to quarterly framework. Okay, but by doing this, I have another problem, a parameter proliferation problem that invalidates the using of traditional estimations, quantile regression, etc. So the methods I will describe after deals with this parameter proliferation problem. Okay, so as I will recall what Chenzo said before, we will use the quantile function or the Taylor's function that is mainly the mean square error version it's the mean square error version applied into quantile framework. Okay, so we want to minimize this objective function that is in terms of the 10% quantile. Okay, so I will not explain this, and I will give you a hint of every model, but I will show you only the best models that we get from our forecast. So the first model is the mixed data sampling quantile model with an almond lag polynomial. Essentially, we take from Mongliani and Simoni, 2021. We use the Bayesian version of this model that is used in Ferrara. We use the Lasso quantile model based on the algorithm of Belloni and Chernosukov, 2019. We use ElasticNet based on the algorithm of Su and Hasty. And we use two-step Lasso quantile. First, we select the daily indicators with Lasso, and then we use principal components in order to further reduce the dimensionality, and then we apply a normal quantile regression. We do the same for ElasticNet, and then we will introduce a rather new method that is adaptive sparse group Lasso of Mendes and Chivieta. Okay, so I'm going to show you just the best model that we get from our nowcasting result, which is Lasso. We have the objective function is equal to the T-close function, okay, that is in a function of the parameters of the model. And we have here the penalization part, which is essentially lasso. Okay, so this is a L1 norm space, and lasso has the characteristic which restricts the non-important or non-significant coefficients equal to 0. Okay, and we calculate this lambda, which is the degree of penalization, as in Belioni and Chernosukov. Okay, and okay, and the other model that I want to present is the adaptive sparse group lasso. It's similar of the before method. It has a lasso part, okay, but it has also a sparse group part. In this part, for example, it can capture not only can select, for example, the coefficients corresponding of the lags of the high frequency vector, but you can introduce like all the high frequency variables once, and you can put into groups, and this part selects which group of high frequency indicators matter the most. Okay, and alpha represents the trade-off between these two methods. Okay, so I'm not gonna talk about the details of the estimation, but like in this method, you can estimate like all the high frequency indicator. You can put all the high frequency indicator and get an estimated version of growth at risk. Okay, and the rest of the models, for the rest of the models that are not the later one, we compute a combined GAR recursively for each model using a combination framework in which we have the conditional quantile of each model for each time, and we multiply here a W term, which is a share of each model that is calculated by the discounted T-close function, and in order that the best, like the best model that has that has the lower T-close function has a higher share in the combined GAR framework. Okay, so for the forecast combination, we use the T-close function, we use the unconditional coverage test and the dynamic quantile test, but I will only show you the main criteria. Okay, moving into the results, the best model is the lasso quantile model. The benchmark model that we take as the traditional GAR model is the individual GAR model that only includes the systemic risk indicator, and the benchmark model is the adaptive sparse group lasso, which do not take into consideration the forecast combination. Okay, so this is the interesting part. The orange line is the GDP growth at risk, the quarterly GDP growth. Sorry, the preliminary estimate. So it's the first estimate for each quarter in real time. You have in blue line the combined growth at risk using lasso. You can see that this moves daily. You have also the benchmark traditional model, which is the growth at risk only using the systemic risk indicator with lasso, and you have this new technique, the growth at risk, using the adaptive sparse group lasso. So what is really interesting? In the first crisis, in the global financial crisis, these are now casting in real time. Recall, I can produce this graph every day. I can calculate this every day in real time. So if we were here, I would tell you it's going to be, there will be a crisis. There is a a decline in the growth at risk. And we can see that it tracks the real data, okay? And it tracks pretty well. And they do the 3 models that we consider, they can capture the global financial crisis really well. But what happens during the onset of the COVID-19, which is really hard to forecast, okay? And that's the most important result that we get. In this, in the onset of the pandemic, namely the first and the second quarter of 2020, our models, by the end of the first quarter, more or less the last week of the first quarter, they can tell you there's gonna be a really huge decline on the GDP growth, okay? And just a couple of 1 week, 1 month after, the decline is really steep, okay? So the combined Gar-Lasso model can really track well the onset of the pandemic, of the COVID-19 pandemic in the US. While the other models, they do not do it really good on the second quarter. You can see that they give you a hint, but then they became stable, okay? So this is our main indicator. And here I show you the daily combination weights for Lasso that we use in our forecast combination scheme. We see that these are the variables. For each one, recall that we estimate one model. We see that during the global financial crisis, the VXO, the model which incorporates the VXO, has a higher share, a higher weight, a higher W. And the credit spread, which is the second most darkest bluish area, has also a higher share. But what happens during the global financial crisis? Why financial indicators do not matter? Because the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic was mostly a real phenomenon, not a financial crisis, okay? So financial indicators, they do really badly to predict the onset of the financial crisis. But what happens with the ADS indicator, which is the only real indicator? It provides the best forecast. And so as it has the lowest T-loss function, the T-loss point, the share is really high, okay? So that's why we say that it depends on which crisis that you look, that financial or real indicators matter. Okay, and finally, I will show you, sorry, that why the last model that I show you does poorly. It's because mainly that the weights are calculated are really stable, okay? So forecast combination, the main takeaway, it's really good to do this nowcast. And here it's just the evaluation, traditional framework versus our framework. This is the relative tail loss against the GAR using just the composite systemic indicators. So if it's less than 1, it's our framework is better, and this is the Bol-Mariano probability of equal predictivity of models. So we do it better, and comparing individual versus combined GAR models for the Lasso Q, we also say that our combined framework does it much better than the individual framework. So as a conclusion, our framework can provide an early signal of GDP downturns in pseudo real time that works well for both the GFC and the COVID-19 episodes. From the financial indicators, VXO and credit spread are important. And most importantly, financial indicators alone were unable to forecast GDP low quantiles. So that's why, for example, the many organizations and central banks could not forecast the downside risk in GDP with the traditional framework. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ignacio. It's time for questions, comments, suggestions.
Thank you for the talk.
Thank
Did you look at other shocks as well, like 2008? Maybe there the financial indicators would do better.
Yes. Here, for example, the weights are driven more to financial indicators, to VXO, credit spread. So yeah, like we estimate for each of these, because it's a huge matrix, we estimate just one model. And then we combine it by using the discount tick loss function. You can combine it, for example, the mean of all the forecasts, but we use like a more sophisticated version of that share, okay? So yes, in the combined framework, we let that the models compete to which will have the best, the higher weight in order to forecast, okay? So in the global financial crisis, we let the financial indicators have more weight. The models that include financial indicators have more weight than the models that use real indicators. And in the later crisis, in the COVID-19 pandemic, we let also speak these indicators in this framework, and we have that the ADS has a really high share. More than 50% of the combined GAR estimate is due only to the model which includes the ADS. And it's important that we do not estimate everything together, because we have this huge high frequency matrix. In order to put quarterly and quarterly, we need to transform the daily matrix into this matrix that I show you. So it's difficult to estimate everything together. We try to do it with this model that allows you to do that, but this model fails to forecast adequately the last crisis. So at the end, we stay with just our simple framework. Yes.
Thank you.
More questions? I have a question that is, have you tried, well, a question, a curiosity. Have you tried your analysis with more extreme quantiles, like 1% or 5%? Or?
No, but it could change. It could change. We do it with the 10% conditional quantile because of the sample size. We estimate the models from 1986 onwards. But for example, there are papers for the US that do it with the 5% quantile, but have a longer sample. So.
Have you investigated, another curiosity, have you investigated, connected with Chencho talk, have you investigated this crossing problem of quantile in this analysis?
No, but I will take into account, yes, I will take.
Thank you very nice. Thank you very much, Ignacio, very nice talk. Last thanks to Ignacio. First session of the day. I think the second session will start in 10 minutes. Thank you very much.